moral laziness is the reason for the inability to see through the moral architecture of the other. Different way of saying moral laziness is moral inflexibility. In other words, you have a way of life, you understand this way of life, and this is all you understand, and you are unable to understand any other way of life. The very fact that they're saying we have a right to choose a religion, when Bilal, as many other slaves at the time, they say we have a right to follow Muhammad, and they have a master. Well, according to clear Arab law, no, you don't. Your master defines your beliefs for you. The very idea that humanity are all brethren and sisters, I mean, that's radical for its age. That is absolutely radical. Where did that come from? You don't find it in Greek philosophy. You don't find it in Jewish theology. You don't find it in Christian theology. It is completely, absolutely absent. Where did it come from? Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So there is we way that we can understand the sacrifices that we are made, because I've reflected upon this whole. You have a collectivity of people that come to this faith, and nearly from the very beginning, it is a saga of sacrifices. I mean, they come to the faith. They're sacrificing social prestige. They're sacrificing social networks. They're sacrificing economically, in many cases, to extreme extents. So much so that among the early first 60 converts, the majority of them do the hijrah to Abyssinia. So the intensity of persecution requires that they sacrifice moving to what must have been for them quite an alienating context, because in Abyssinia, they are amongst people that are speaking a different language, that is a different culture altogether, that even if they have a tolerant king, they are still outsiders to the societies that they go to. And then nearly again, all of them, upon returning to join the Prophet ﷺ, they do their second hijrah to Medina and go back to the tafsir of the surah of the Medinian revelations, early Medinian revelations, because if you remember, we talked at length in this surah about the context of the sacrifices made by those who did the hijrah. So this saga of sacrifices that ends with so many of them, so many of the early 60s converts to Islam will end up martyred in battle, one of the battles or another, including, of course, including the Prophet's adopted son, Zayd ibn Haritha. If you remember, Zayd ibn Haritha, this is the guy who is so close to the Prophet ﷺ that the Prophet tries to make him his inheritor because he literally tries to adopt him after Zayd ibn Harisa he's abducted into and sold into slavery, and when his family manages to relocate him, they go to the Prophet. This is the man where the Prophet gives him a choice whether to stay with him or go back with his family, and he chooses to stay with the Prophet. And someone, even Zayd ibn Harisa, will die in battle. Now, so this level of sacrifice, try to imagine the theology, because it is very important when we are trying to put ourselves, and it's a critical part of why is history informative? Well, history is the most direct and powerful way that history is informative is to try to imagine that you are the person confronting the historical challenges, whatever they might be, and ask yourself whether what would have been the course of action you would have taken. So this goes back to this point that I was making, that this level of sacrifice and selflessness would not be possible without the philosophy of Takaful, that you are the guarantor for one another. You are the security for one another. You are the caretakers of one another. And this is what one sees as the element that is most absent in Muslim societies, to the extent that one of the constant complaints among converts is that we convert, and then when we go to Islamic centers or Islamic spaces, we don't feel welcome. That's the absence of takaful. That means what? You have not internalized the perspective of the convert, that you are engaged with the convert from a self-involved point of view. You don't put yourself in their shoes. You put yourself only, you see the world only through the prism of your own experience. Let me just, I know that there are things that connect that you're forced to comment on, because ethical thinking is often all interconnected. One of the main reasons for the lack, we call it empathy. I mean, whether a person is empathetic or not, but what we're really talking about is the ability to see things not from the point of view of your own boundaries and your own, the architecture of your own life, since I've been using this word, but the architecture of the life of the other. Well, why does this happen? Moral laziness is the reason for the inability to see through the moral architecture of the other. A different way of saying moral laziness is moral inflexibility. In other words, you have a way of life, you understand this way of life, and this is all you understand, and you are unable to understand any other way of life. Why is that? Because you cannot in any way pretend to imagine or to try to internalize, again, we use the word empathy, but to try to see things from a perspective other than your own. The more a person, and this is generally, the more educated a person, the more morally elevated a person, the more ethically enlightened the person, the greater their ability to see things from the perspectives of others. And poor education, not only poor education, but also poor upbringing. When a person is raised in an authoritarian context, like their parents are despotic or authoritarian, the less their ability. Ironically, often trauma allows you to see things from the perspectives of others, but unless of course, it breaks you. But trauma is a great teacher of empathy. But putting trauma aside, sadly, despotism is, because part of despotism is that you have an authority figure that teaches you, you will see things through my eyes. And so you don't learn the art of empathy. And part of what happens from being a reader, a person who reads, is exactly moral insight. So you learn to see life, you learn to see normative issues from various perspectives, because your mind learns flexibility and elasticity through the art of reading. If you don't read, if you are a poorly educated person, and this is again why in societies in which educational systems are abysmal, you find this constant problem of the dynamics of authoritarianism, where people are, and one of the remarkable things about the Sirah of the Prophet, ﷺ, about the Prophet, and as an educator, as you know, the word is mu'allim, as a mu'allim, as an educator, as a teacher, he is constantly teaching his followers to empathize and to see things through the eyes of their brothers and sisters. And this is precisely when we say, why was the ethic of such sacrifice possible for these people? Well, one, because they understood through their teacher the value of this life, that they fully embraced the idea that this life is not the end all, that there's the real life is yet to come. But second, they learned through the actual teachings of their teacher, both from everything from his dua and his living example, is that you are not existing in the universe of your own boundaries, and that is it. And again, I mean, I've read enough in psychology to know what are the issues, but I'm no expert in psychology. But Muslims, I really dream of the day that Muslims rise to the challenge of informing or enriching the rest of us as to whether, because I know that any system of knowledge is culturally biased. There is no, whether it's history, it's philosophy, even science is culturally biased. Even empirical sciences are culturally biased. So it is impossible for psychology not to be culturally biased. But that's just a critique. A critique is worthless unless you give me the alternative. So to critique modern prevailing psychology, which is Western psychology, because that's the only system of psychology I am aware of, I've read things about that claim to be in communal psychology or Asian psychology or Buddhist-informed psychology, not nearly as developed or nearly as rigorous or systematic or so on. So the example of the Prophet ﷺ raises in my mind many questions about the prevailing system of psychological insight, which is Western-based, because many of his examples do not seem to me to be consistent with what I've read. So is that true? And what is the solution? Because that is not sufficient to just say that and leave it at that. That would be highly inadequate. You can't tell people, I'm going to take away something from you without giving them the alternative. That's morally irresponsible. And so again, this is just, I know that as Muslims we have numerous challenges, but this is one of the most compelling in my view. Because as I'm not this is not original to me. This has been raised by a number of philosophers who have said that Western psychology is the secular religion of the age we live in, that it has replaced religion effectively. It has become the system of belief that is often accepted uncritically and as a matter of conviction. It is because it is. Because again, as I think of just the many examples of even someone like the Prophet's son who ends up giving up his life in battle. Among again or Abu Ubayda ibn Jarrah, who was among the first believers, he converted by most reports, or even the overwhelming majority of reports, before Dar al-Arqam, so that would have been very early. And we find that Abu Ubayda, who will turn out to be a great military strategist, but at that time in Mecca, there was no indications that he was actually of his talent in this aspect. But what is, again, striking about him is that the level of conviction that someone or like Abu Ubayda, who will dedicate his entire life to Islam, but immediately he, as a consequence of becoming Muslim, his trade is affected to the point that there are reports that he loses all his trade, that he, in fact, the financial losses are over. There are other reports says, no, he didn't lose all of it, but it greatly affected him. He eventually abandons everything, including his business and his house, and immigrates to Abyssinia. And it didn't mean Abu Ubayda was not from one of the powerful tribes of Quraysh. He was not from Banu Umayyah. He was not from Banu Hashim. So when he left his property and immigrated to Abyssinia, the Meccans took it. They basically just, it's like the same principle of eminent domain. You abandoned your property, so it's ours now. So, and this is the council of elders in Mecca made the decision that those who immigrate, followers of Muhammad who immigrate, and they leave their property, we will not, unless they come from a prominent tribe, unless they're from Banu Umayyah, then we'll leave that to their tribe to decide. But if they're not from a prominent tribe, then their property is fair game to us, meaning we sell it. And there was some dispute as to how do we share the profits. Do we give to the prophets, again, typical Qurayshi style? Do we give it to the prophets shared by the prominent families alone, Or do we include the neighbors who were often, the neighbors in the property were often not from prominent families? And, so it's a debate that ultimately was resolved that we should give some of the money in the neighbors to encourage the neighbors not to follow Muhammad. So, and it's interesting again that the normal behavior was, we're the prominent families, the money's ours. But because of the threat of Muhammad, they said, okay, well, let's have the neighbors share some of it. Now, I have no idea what type of money was generated by, like, the property of Abu Ubayda ibn Jarrah. But it is striking because people often imagine that, they immigrate to Abyssinia. Well, but you are coming to a phase that is going to affect your entire career. You are, in fact, you are raised with the idea in Quraysh society, especially if you don't come from a prominent family, you are nothing if you don't have money. Your worth in society, you don't come from a family that will give you a seat in the Diwan of Mecca. So what is going to preserve your status is the amount of money you have. And you come to a faith that is going to mean huge financial losses, eventually abandonment of your business and your property. You're going to go live in an alien society, as Abu Ubayda ibn Jarrah did in Abyssinia. Then you're going to come back knowing that you have nothing left, and you're going to migrate to Medina. And we'll get to the migration, but you know that you are so destitute that there will be another social security system, and that is the social security in which the Medinians, the new converts, are now going to help bail out the Meccan migrants. Ask yourself, and this is really what it's all about, ask yourself, if you were there at the time, would you have been Abu Ubayda ibn Jarrah? Would you have said, okay, yeah, this moral example that I see, this man that I see, with his message about taking care of the destitute, of caring for one another, of humanity, the very idea that humanity are all brethren and sisters. I mean, that's radical for its age. We read it today and say, oh yeah, but that is absolutely radical for the age. That he's sitting there talking to God and saying, I bear witness that we're all brothers and sisters. Where did that come from? You don't find it in Greek philosophy. You don't find it in Jewish theology. You don't find it in Christian theology. It is completely, absolutely absent. Where did it come from? And ask yourself, would you have been one of the converts who makes these level of sacrifices for a conviction? You take someone like of the very famous Bilal, right? We know that Bilal was an African fellow. We know that he becomes the muezzin of the Rasul, that he had a beautiful voice, and again, one of the things that I pause on is that the Prophet ﷺ, obviously, if the Prophet said Bilal should do the adhan, and we have numerous reports about Bilal's voice being beautiful, it was not just a matter of voice, but it must have been that Bilal performs the adhan in an aesthetically pleasing way. And I've always posited the fact that the Prophet ﷺ said, I want what is aesthetically pleasing, what is musically elevating. I don't want to hear an adhan that is nashaz, atonal, or but that is pleasing to the ear. And we know that Bilal is going to be among the first to be tortured, because as it's his slave status, the, and again, the conversion of slaves and the threat they posed is something that we will talk about. But one of the things that strikes me is that, so Bilal is owned by a fellow called Umayyah bin Khalaf, and Umayyah bin Khalaf is going to torture Bilal savagely. And according to the majority reports, although sadly for sectarian reasons, that is, in some Shia sources, that is challenged. But again, sectarianism is very ugly, whether it's Shia side or Sunni side. That who buys his freedom is Abu Bakr. That Abu Bakr see him being tortured, and he, and Abu Bakr makes it a practice, because once he hears that the Quran says fakku raqaba, that one of the ways that you attain elevated status with Allah is that you free slaves, Abu Bakr spends an enormous amount of wealth. So that depending on the source you're reading, how much of his wealth, but clearly it was quite substantial, where he goes around buying slaves and freeing them. So slaves who convert to Islam, and among them is Bilal. So much so that his father, Abu Bakr's father, sees him doing this, and his father worries about his son. He's saying, you're spending as if there's no tomorrow. You are buying and freeing individuals who look to me like scrawny and weak. If you're going to go spend all this money buying and freeing slaves, why don't you buy and free powerful men? So then they can, because of their sense of fidelity and sense of gratitude, then they can become your protection. And Abu Bakr completely, basically, doesn't even respond to his father, but is clearly displeased. And I can completely imagine why. It's Abu Bakr understands that his father is coming from a paradigm that is completely different than his own. And so where do I start? How do I explain to you that this is not about me when I'm spending all this money freeing slaves and spending as if there's no tomorrow, and spending to you what appears like I am just being irresponsible in my spending? That the way I understand money and wealth is that it serves a purpose, and that if I don't spend it to achieve that purpose, then there's no point. But one of the reports that when Bilal is remembering, narrated by Bilal, remembering his encounter with Abu Bakr, his conversion to Islam, and he is asked, he's explaining the reasons for him becoming a Muslim. He says, رأيت دعوة لا تفرق بين السادة والعبيد. I heard a message that doesn't differentiate between masters and slaves. Now, again, that's why we call it today a liberal arts education, but what it means is a well-rounded education. But so, whether you use the expression liberal arts or well-rounded, that's why well-rounded education is very important. Because if you have a well-rounded education, you will have the sophistication to understand that at that historical moment, at that time in history, this statement is earth-shattering, is absolutely radical. You cannot read it with the epistemology of your modern age. Because I assure you, and this is something, I mean, God, if I had a few more lifetimes to write everything that I want to write, I assure you that the very dynamic that led to the Protestant Reformation, which in turn led to the theology of liberation for slaves, would not have existed but for the Islamic intervention. So it is a continuum of it's like human beings learn and teach one another. And although the West have gone, done or let's say the Christian tradition, Judaism as well after the establishment of Israel, but before that, they didn't go to the extra mile to try to deny their gratitude to the Islamic contribution. But the Christian tradition, particularly the Reformation, had tried to erase the Islamic vestiges of their achievement. But I am claiming that indeed humanity would have never or might have realized much later the very idea of that slavery is immoral wrong would not have done that, and would not, the very emancipation movement for slaves would not have occurred but for the Islamic civilization. Because when Bilal is saying that this man is teaching a dawah, a message that does not differentiate between master and slave, you have to pause and say, okay, you are coming to slaves and saying to them, not in creation are you inferior, and not in so. And I believe that although it is corrupted by imperial law later, but for the Prophet ﷺ, everything that the Prophet taught is that you are also legally no lesser than you have your rights. And that is why when Bilal, as many other slaves at the time, they say, we have a right to follow Muhammad, and they have a master. Well, according to clear Arab law, no, you don't. You don't. Your master defines your beliefs for you. So the very fact that they're saying we have a right to choose a religion, look, what happened? Take the example of slavery in the United States. By law, the slaves in the United States did not have a right to adopt a faith but the faith of their masters. This was elementary, and adopting, you choosing your own faith, and that's why none of the slaves were Muslim or any of the other tribal religions. None of them survived. Because by law, you had to adopt if your master was Baptist, you had to be Baptist. If your master was Protestant, you had to be Protestant. There was this issue, well, what if your master was Catholic? And this was a debate in American law, whether, can you be And the answer was ultimately no, because we couldn't afford to have a slave choose a faith, even if it's an evil faith like Catholicism. But the slave would be told what faith to have by their master. And there was, there was a sort of a cheeky, there was a exception that some, in very rare occasions, you had a slave owner in America that would allow their slave to be Muslim. But then, in the course I teach about Muslims, race, and law, we talk about this. But then the American imagination would imagine these slaves who were allowed to stay Muslim by masters to be a prince of, so they would give them princehood status. It's a really fascinating social dynamic. But anyway, so when these slaves, supported by the Prophet and his followers, would come to their masters and say, we are going to follow Muhammad, we are going to adopt a religion, you are saying something that is, for the Moors of the day, very offensive. This is what this man is teaching you? You as a slave, you have a right to say that you don't have a religion other than what your master says you're going to have? And imagine what precedent this created. You know what, and then you can start understanding why Mecca started freaking out. Because as we will see, there are stories of violence nearly immediately, like the beating of Abu Dharr, but there are many other examples, as we will see. And when you ask yourself why, well, because it was a truly threatening message. With Abu Bakr going around, and not just Abu Bakr, but we have many other examples, like even the example of Salman al-Farisi, which the entire Muslim community basically, and this is what when after people like Abu Bakr and Aisha, and Khadija, spend all their money, and they have no more money, buying the freedom of slaves became the responsibility, the communal responsibility of the Muslim community. They would collect donations to purchase the slavery, and like they did with Salman al-Farisi, for instance. And we'll talk about other examples. But this is what I mean by system of takaful. So you are sharing social responsibility for collective problems. And just the idea that my slave can pick a faith, and now not just pick a faith, but now he's telling me, I have to go, I have to leave my work, I have to leave the house, I have to leave you, my master, and go pray with these people called Muslims and Muhammad. So when we keep reading in the sources that the Meccans are telling the Prophet, you have taught our slaves to be insolent and to defy us, and you don't have a historical context, you let it pass without reflection. But then you start understanding the historical moment. And the question that you always, why do we study history? To ask yourself a very simple question. Always. Would you have been on the right side of history? Because seeing things in retrospect is very easy. And it's very easy to make the assumption, oh yes, I would have been one of the heroes of Badr. Oh yes, I would have been, one of the, I would have, but examine yourself, because that is why we study history. Would you have been on the right side of history with everything? Even when we study the legacy of dictators, and we hear about this dictator committed such and such massacre, or butchered such a, would you have been on the right side of history? Or when we read about the Inquisition or the Mihna of this and that, would you have been on the right side of history? Because it is history. If you don't ask it, history can become a form of moral escapism. This is why you find so many people that will tell you stories about history and sound like they're very moral people. Because they tell you the stories with the assumption, of course, we would be on side. And then you look at their life, their current life, the life that the moment of life that they're living, and you find they are completely on the wrong side of morality. And you ask yourself, how is this possible? They say these wonderful stories about the Sahaba and these wonderfully ethical, moral stories, but then I look at their conduct and it doesn't bear out. How is this possible? It's possible because they use history for moral escapism. They use the assumption, of course, I would have been on the right side of history, to escape the obligation to be moral now, in their moment. And that is not what history is for. That's toxic history. That's a toxic way of dealing with history. History is to get you to self-examine whether, well, if your answer is yes, I would have been on the right side of history, then immediately the question that follows, are you on the right side of history now? And if the answer is no, I would not have been on the right side of history, then at least you're honest. But then, what's wrong with you? And what things do you need to work on to become on the right side of history? That's how nations are built, by the way. That's why education makes a huge difference. That's why you can learn history with one teacher and find that your life is transformed, and learn history with another teacher and find that you've become morally lazy and morally completely ineffective. It's as if that teacher has laid layers of toxicity on your moral thinking, although it looks like you're learning the same material. But it is what you do with it. Okay, alhamdulillah, let's stop here. Any questions?
Okay, Assalamu alaikum. So, from the conference, 2024 conference in October, you introduced a concept that really resonated with me, where you said that if all we had was Ibn Ishaq, we wouldn't have Sufism, which to me was implying that love for the Prophet comes from more than just the earliest sources. So I guess the question is because it came up today, especially the early Islamic history, the Orientalist approaches to it, etc. When we talk about this corpus, what point are you trying to make there? Is that this corpus alone is just a chronology that has a bunch of facts in it that we have to make something out of it? I guess this is my main question.
Yeah, no. Ibn Ishaq and Ibn Hisham, they're debated as there's intense debate in the hadith literature about the reliability of Ibn Ishaq. There is a lot of questions about, about his reliability, and so that's one issue. But historically, contextually reliable narratives that allows us insight into the character of the Prophet ﷺ do not come from Ibn Ishaq.
I see.
Okay, so but that was, again, I was making this point in a larger context, but because your question really has to do with the sources, and it's not just about Ibn Ishaq. I have several points. Point number one, the imperative of historical methodology when wrestling with history in large, but the Sirah in particular. And historical methodology doesn't guarantee you, like all methodologies, it doesn't guarantee you the truth, but it guarantees you a rigorous, systematic way of looking at something that can be held accountable. So I know where you're coming from, and I know what type of historical questions you pose, what type of historical conclusions you've reached, and why. And it is what's really interesting is that what's very fascinating is that we find that even in Muslim chronicles, there is a great deal of disagreement. I mean, when we would find even the disagreements about whether Isra or Mi'raj, for instance, happened in the first 3 years or happened towards the end of the Meccan period, or we find a disagreement about the role of even the whole issue of Khilafah and the debate between Abu Bakr and Umar. What they were actually having were historical methodologies, but the way in their day and age, the way epistemology and knowledge worked was not that you laid out your methodology. Your methodology was often discovered through your theological assumptions. So my point, we have to understand that all history, even that was written with methodology, always active, even in the raw material that we have. Bukhari was a product of his own methodology, and his methodology as to. So for Bukhari, for instance, one of the biggest things is that he didn't think that a narrator of hadith that was allied or close to or closely allied to a despot, to one of the Umayyad rulers, impeached his testimony. That's for Bukhari. He accepted the testimony of many chronicles but there are other muhaddithun who said, no, if you had a close relationship to sulta, to power, that impeached your credibility. That's the methodology. That's a methodological dispute. And so when I say we need number one is to acknowledge methodology. Second, with the Sirah in particular, is the imperative of an ethically committed approach to the Sirah. And where does the ethics, ethically committed means you make ethical commitments. Well, where do your ethical commitments come from? They have to come from the Quran. My whole argument about the muhkam and mutashabih, which I went through in the tafsir, that there are muhkamat in the Quran, and the muhkamat are these ethical principles that are foundational. And for me, that any part of the Sirah that are not consistent, and it is not, again, it's not an authoritarian rule. So I would not declare, oh, this hadith is not ethically consistent with the Quran, so I exclude it. I make an argument. But I have the right to make the argument, and what I'm urging is that we all acknowledge that when Allah told us that this is a man of great ethical character, it must have meant something. And what it means is that the ethics of this man must be consistent with the Quranic message, and especially the muhkamat in the Quran. 3, and this is now a more subtle point, is that ahadith, I don't exclude any ahadith. I examine all ahadith in the same way. I don't exclude any historical material. I examine and analyze any historical material. But we must recognize that ahadith are a dangerous way of knowing history. Very dangerous way. Imagine if I try to know you through quotes reported about you. You know, someone comes and says Khalid Abou El Fadl said XYZ. What does that tell me about him? How does this allow you to know anything about him? It's just a quote, and the quote could have been taken out of context. The quote could have had, this quote could have been in part of a whole dynamic and engagement or a whole social interaction or quotes. So even if authentic, even if we assume that the reporter, the narrator, has authentically conveying the quote, quotes are a very dangerous way of trying to understand the moral architecture of the personality of the Prophet ﷺ. It doesn't mean I exclude them, because I don't have the arrogance to exclude anything. But it means that I have to have a very healthy skepticism as to what is your context, what are you saying, that I won't rely. So among the things that for me, I won't allow a matter or a quote to be dispositive on an ethical question, that especially if it's among the muhkamat in the Quran. And so I will examine it, I will evaluate it, I will see if it's collaborated by collaborative evidence. But ultimately, if it's not, I will give it much lesser weight. So, and also part of the historical methodology and the ethical approach is that it is absolutely it's a moral obligation upon me to look at the political motivations. So for instance, you find in so many Islamic narrative an image of a Jew. You find in so many Islamic narrative that the Jew, from the beginning of the da'wah, are always portrayed as someone who, upon hearing of the appearance of the Prophet ﷺ, says, "Oh my God, the person who is going to slaughter us has appeared." To me, that reeks of that reeks of something being the product of the historical moment in which people are aware of what transpired with the Jewish tribes, how the conflict with the Jewish tribes went, and then relying on ethnic biases and racial biases, went back and attributed these narratives that we know that are entirely inconsistent with the God of the Quran. The idea that somehow the appearance of our Prophet means the Jews knew, it means slaughter for us. That's a deeply offensive, immoral picture. And when we continue to repeat these stories, and then we teach them to our children, because I've seen these types of narratives taught to children in the United States all the time. And then when our children will ask, if we have a child, the only way you're going to prevent your child from asking the perceptive questions is that you're going to teach your child to be dumb. Because if you teach them classes like this, a smart child is going to say, "But wait, doesn't this sound like ethnic bias, or doesn't this sound racist? Doesn't this sound like, why would be the appearance of the prophet equated to the slaughter of Jews? And why would and if they and then if you insist on teaching your children narratives like this as if they're the truth, then the teacher of necessity will say, shut up and don't ask questions. Well, then you're teaching the child to be stupid. And so our tradition, I hate to say it, we're not talking about, something that is rocket science. We're talking about just rigor in taking our tradition in a rigorously, intellectually rigorous way, and a way that is liberating, because intellectual rigor liberates. You then will not be afraid, or when we have how can I teach my child that Bukhari is all correct when I know that in Bukhari are ahadith, oral statements, which, as I said, are for me suspect just by themselves like that, which if my child if my child takes my teachings seriously, that render women in a way that no amount of rhetoric about liberating women is, because that clearly say, for instance, that tell a woman your own sexual desire is irrelevant. If your husband wants you for sex, it is your obligation to obey. And if a child, again, has intelligence and asks his teacher, but teacher, does it work the other way around? What if the woman wants and the husband doesn't? And then the teacher can't lie and say, yes, it works the other way, because he knows it doesn't. But the likelihood, they'll say, shut up and don't ask questions. You're teaching the kid, again, to be stupid. And then we are upset when our children grow up either alienated from religion or reproduce the stupidity in the tradition itself. Because to raise some people to be intelligent, you must treat them intelligently, because intelligence is like a muscle that you train. So these, and there are other implications that inshallah we'll explore as we get to them, but these are the main ones that I want to underscore right now.
If I could really quickly follow up, or am I out of time? So there's an idea, if you're a graduate student at some of the top, Islamic studies programs, that you would take generational social history. You would take that tabaqat literature, and you would basically kind of reconstruct, this early history. So would you agree that that's how you see the biographical dictionaries, as generational social histories of the individuals that we knew?
Yes. I mean, it would be a very interesting methodology if done, but just with the caveat that, one of the ailments of academia, and again, it's just the difference between good scholarship and bad scholarship, is that sometimes people develop a methodology that then they use to explain everything. Just the caveat that even that methodology, it's a I think useful exercise. It will lead interesting insights, but have the humility to know that it doesn't mean that it yields all insight. It's a step, just, but because we when things are so overall, the intellectual atmosphere is so bad that we keep seeing this happening again. Someone emerges that yields a little bit of insight as to something, and then they suddenly they see themselves as a know-it-all, and people see them as a know-it-all, and then we get into the same trap of it wears itself out, because anything that you just say, oh yeah, that's the answer to everything, well, obviously it's not a surprise that then eventually you realize it wasn't, and then you know we keep going into these fads. But I mean, it would be useful intellectual contribution, I think. Okay, alhamdulillah. Like that video that you sent me of the British nurse crying, begging with Egyptian authorities. Did you see that? Right, sent it to me. I just it messed me up.
I couldn't sleep. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, but it's. I mean, like, okay, what do you say? This man is crying because he wants to get aid to Gaza with supposedly Muslims. This is the point where you really realize the extent to which we are not Muslims, and that we need a complete re-education about our Prophet, because we know, you and I and everyone, I am sure everyone intuitively knows that the Prophet ﷺ, where he would have sided, with the Egyptian or with the Christian British. All of us know. But it is.
He's invoking the concept of ummah to the Muslim as a non-Muslim.
Yeah.
Why don't you care about your?
Yeah, why, yeah.
Why do you not understand this? That you're an Islamic people, right? That's what he said.
Yeah.
Why don't you understand this?
Why don't you care about your fellow Muslims? Basically, is what he's saying.
He mentioned how the woman was pregnant and she can't even feed her child. Like it's.
It is. This is all what, yani, this is all what despotism has done to us. Because that British nurse would. The reason he is the way he is because he knows, even if Britain doesn't support his political position, he's going to go back home. No, he's not going to be arrested. He's not going to be tortured. He's not going to be violated. While we have grown with generational trauma of violations and fear. So that Egyptian soldier, his psychological makeup is embedded in fear, and in the fear is the real God. هو الرب الأعلى.
It feels like the British had Takaful.
Yeah, exactly. مبدأ التكافل. يعني it really messed me up. I just.
I feel bad now.
No, I mean, I'm happy as well, because I'm going to bring it up in a khutbah, I'm sure. I think it's worth talking about it, but it just, yani, if you keep hitting there, things keep happening where you say, okay, in new law, the entire ummah, after seeing this, must change, and you find the ummah just dead. Nothing changes.